Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. My name is Benji, and today we're talking about jargon in Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, the term affects the player. It's important to know what players are talking about when they say something affects the player, if they're going to be using it correctly when talking to another player, or if a player isn't familiar with it so that they can explain it to the other players, or ask for clarification if something is unclear. So I'm just going to discuss this particular piece of jargon. The one and only card in the game that actually specifically mentions affecting a player or targeting a player is Mystical Ref Panel, which is a card that has exactly one print, and is one of the most confusing and most difficult cards to actually understand what this card does. So if we read it closely, it says, activate only when a spell card, specifically a spell card that targets one player, is activated. The effect of that spell card is applied to the other player instead. Now, this does not tell you what this card does. This card actually has an entire rulings database of the specific cards that it actually affects. This card, as far as I know, is very successful in one Nationals format, where it was played by the winner of Nationals using Domain Monarchs to draw cards off of their opponent's theism of the Monarchs. But with the exception of that, I don't know when this card has been used before, but there is a link to this webpage from the Yugioh organization, which is the place that translates all kinds of rulings from the OCG database and provides leaks of cards from the OCG by translating them for us. So if you'd like to know more about Mystical Ref Panel, you can look there. But targeting a player is not what we're talking about in the sense of Mystical Ref Panel. We are talking about this new card here, Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon, which is a new trap card that just came out in Darkwing Blast. It is a TCG exclusive, and being a TCG exclusive, that means we do not have any official rulings on how this card will work. Let's read the text of this card. It says, changes many monsters on the field to face-down defense position. Then, if either player controls a face-up monster or monsters, they must send all face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. Now, whenever you see a card that says the word "they must," implies that the player is forced to take an action. So the player is forced to send the monsters that they control to the graveyard. Therefore, this card does not affect the monsters. It is forcing the player to do something. This is the closest thing to what actually would be referred to as affecting the player. When a player is forced to do something, or if a player cannot do something, that is when a player is affected. Now, it is not officially a game term, but it is important to know that this means that a card is not affecting certain cards. So this means that this card can be used to deal with unaffected monsters, which is pretty cool. So this card has the ability to deal with unaffected monsters by forcing the opponent to send them to the graveyard if they remain face up. The next card we're going to talk about is Mystic Mine. Mystic Mine is a card that people say targets a player or affects a player, and the reason for that is the effect of Mystic Mine specifically puts a restriction on a player. So let's read Mystic Mine. It says, if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, your opponent cannot activate monster effects or declare attacks. If you control more monsters than your opponent does, you cannot activate monster effects or declare attacks. So this card actually puts a restriction on both players, depending on who has more monsters, that they cannot declare attacks nor activate monster effects. So this card also does not affect monsters, which is why unaffected monsters cannot declare attacks under Mystic Mine. Please watch my video on 5 tips on Mystic Mine if you want more information regarding that. But this is another card that somewhat affects a player in the ability that it prevents certain actions from even being. Next is Evenly Matched, which I believe is one of the first cards that people even thought of when they were thinking of cards that affects the players, because they wanted to know if this would trigger things like Sky Striker Ace Ray, if you were removing their cards using a card effect, or by game action, by the action of a card's, or by the action of a player. So here's what Evenly Matched says. It says, at the end of the battle phase, if your opponent controls more cards than you do, you can make your opponent, that is the keywords, banish cards from their field face down so that they control the same number of cards as you do. If you have no cards, you can activate this card from your hand. So this card forces your opponent to do something that normally they can't do, which is just to banish their own cards. So the opponent is banishing the cards themselves. So this is a action taken by the player, which is not the effect of the card. So the card itself is not what's making the cards be banished. It is the action of the player, which is the card forces them to do. Generally, cards that affect the player will say something along the lines of they must or your opponent must. Some implication that the player is doing something and not that it affects the monsters. The next card that does this is called Trickstar Light Stage. It was theorized for a while that Trickstar Light Stage would trigger the effect of Waking the Dragon, which says if a card is sent to the graveyard by opponent's card effect, you can special summon a monster from your extra deck. Trickstar Light Stage does not trigger that effect because it forces a player action. So let's read Trickstar Light Stage and see what the player action is. It says that when this card is activated, you can add a Trickstar monster from your deck to your hand. That part is not the part we're looking at. Once per turn, you can target one set card in your opponent's spell and trap card zone. While this card is in the field zone, that set card cannot be activated until the end phase, and your opponent must activate it during the end phase or else send it to the graveyard. So this is the part that affects the player. The player has to make a decision during the end phase if they would like to activate the card or send it to the graveyard. This is an action forced upon the player, so the player is making a choice. This is not the effect. The effect of the card makes the player make this choice, but the card being sent to the graveyard is sent by the player's decision. The next card we're going to be discussing is Gozen Match. This will also apply to There Can Be Only One or Rivalry of the Warlords. All of these cards force both players to make a game action. So the effect says each player can only control one attribute of monster. Send all other face-up monsters they control to the graveyards. They control is a player action kind of term. So whenever you see the words they control or they must, these are signs that a card affects the player in the sense that it does not affect the cards themselves. So the cards are being moved, but the action is being taken by the player, therefore it plays around cards that are unaffected by card effects. Now, the one exception that seems to exist is on some slightly older cards are cards that affect cards in the hand, such as Mind Crush. They actually say the words like they must or they discard, but apparently these cards actually do affect the cards, which is interesting, so this might be an exception, so I'm just going to address it. Mind Crush says declare one card name. If that card is in your opponent's hand, they must discard all copies of the card, otherwise you discard one random card. So both players must have at least one card in the hand in order to activate Mind Crush, and apparently if the card is discarded by the effect of Mind Crush, it is considered to affect the card. I believe this just might have to do with the fact that cards in hand are unknown, and the fact that cards in hand are unknown, it's probably not the easiest way to phrase it that they would use a word other than... so the word they tends to imply that a card affects a player. Seems to be the exception are cards that affect cards in the hand. And if you have any more questions about Rivalry of the Warlords, please click this video. I put this up a long time ago. It covers Rivalry of the Warlords, Gozen Match, and There Can Be Only One. And I'll see you guys next time.